Okay, hi everyone. I think we'll have a few more people trickling in over the next 10 minutes, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to day 2 of the Africa Evidence Summit. We're so excited to have another great day of presentations today with a similar format to yesterday. But to start off the day, we're going to have a panel discussion on African-led impact evaluation. Then we'll have a short break and go into a similar format to yesterday with 2 research presentations and accompanying policy discussants, as well as lightning talks on gender and education. And I'll have Dustin I'll put the link to the agenda again in the chat so you can see the specific details for the day. As a reminder, please feel free during the Q&A session to use the raise hand feature on the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen in the reactions panel. So if you want to ask your question live, we would love to have several of you raise your hand to ask your question, and you can also continue to put your questions in the chat. And finally, I just want to remind everyone that we're going to follow along on Twitter. We'll be tweeting throughout the day on the SIGA and NERA handle. You can see at the bottom of the screen here, and you can use the hashtag 2021 Africa Evidence Summit. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panel of the day. We'll have 3 East Fellows and NERA members, Annette Adong, Constantine Manda, and Ronald Mula-Beke on this panel, who are leaders in this space. And we'll also have Charles Amawate, who's the program director for DIWA, as well as Jane Mariara, who's the executive director for Partnership for Economic Policy. And Carson Cristiano, our executive director at SIGA, will be moderating the panel. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Carson to start off the panel.
Hey, thanks, Chelsea. And good morning, afternoon, evening to everybody who's joining. I guess we'll pull all of the videos up of the panelists now. Great. So it's nice to sort of see everyone again today. I'm delighted. I'm Carson Cristiano, the ED of SIGA. As Chelsea mentioned, I'm delighted to be moderating this panel on African-led impact evaluation to kick off day 2 of our evidence summit. Some of you will remember that yesterday we talked about why SIGA invests so much in building the capacity of researchers from low and middle income countries. We mentioned a few programs that we run, including EAST, the East Africa Social Science Translation Collaborative, and DIWA, Development Impact West Africa, that are designed to help bring more local voices into research and policy debates. And Maya noted that there's an enormous gap in terms of publications. So LMIC institutions accounted for less than 10% of randomized controlled trials that were published in the top 6 econ journals in 2020. The numbers, I think, are a lot more discouraging if you look specifically at research that's focused on Africa. Of course, using published RCTs as a metric for participation in development economics research is inherently flawed, because RCTs are not the only way that African scholars can contribute to social science that's shaping policy on the continent. And I definitely want to talk about that with my colleagues here today. But I think that we can all agree that the voices of researchers from high-income country institutions, including UC Berkeley, where I'm based, are much louder than those from the countries where our research is focused, and that's a problem. So as I mentioned, and as you heard yesterday, SIGA's response to this issue has been to prioritize the inclusion of LMIC researchers in our work by hosting fellowship programs, by inviting African scholars and scholars from other low and middle income countries to speak at and participate in SIGA events, and by distributing research funding to projects that are led by or entirely conducted by scholars from LMICs. But we're always learning, and we have a lot to learn from the institutions, from the African institutions who are spearheading their own successful efforts, and you are going to hear from them today. So this panel is going to showcase just a handful of institutions and efforts that are working to drive more inclusion in global development research, and specifically impact evaluation research. Some of these efforts are brand new, like IEED at Makerere University. We have Ronald joining us today. And some have been around for much longer, like ESRF in Tanzania and Partnership for Economic Policy. I'm going to start by having each of our panelists just very briefly introduce themselves and the programs that they represent, and then we'll go ahead and dive into our questions. And for those of you in the audience, I know that you're going to have lots of questions for our panel, so please put them in the chat, and we'll have time a bit later in the hour to address some of them. So why don't we go around to our 5 panelists, starting with Jane, just because I see you first on my screen here, and just take a few moments to introduce yourself and your program.
Okay, thank you very much, Carson, for this opportunity. Hello, everyone. I'm Jane Mariera. I'm the Executive Director of the Partnership for Economic Policy. PEP is an international NGO that focuses on capacity building. We support local researchers intensively, building their capacity for research and policy engagement. And one of our directorates deals with impact evaluation. And among other things, currently we have ongoing work on impact, on strengthening the capacity for impact evaluation in Eastern and West Africa, supported by Hewlett Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Annette.
Thank you so much. My name is Anita Dong, a postdoctoral researcher at University of Bonn. So I'm a member of the Network of Impact Evaluators in Africa, NERA. NERA is an association that brings together independent researchers that have previously been East African Social Translation, that have previously been fellows at the East African Social Translation Collaborative in UC Berkeley. So now it's more of an independent association now with 4 mandates. The first one is generating evidence. The second is policy outreach. The third is sustainability, ensuring sustainability of the project. And lastly is, I think basically the 3, yes. So thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you, Annette. Charles, please go ahead.
All right, so thank you very much. My name is Charles Amwate, and I'm the program director for DIWA. DIWA is Development Impact West Africa, that is hosted at the Ghana Institute of Management and Public Administration. GIMPA is an institution, a public university in Ghana with a main mandate to build capacity of the public sector to achieve government goals. DIWA was established in 2019 and implemented in collaboration with SIGA of UC Berkeley with generous financial support from the Hewlett Foundation. Our main objective is to bridge the gap between policy making and generation of knowledge. So we kind of seed researchers with policy makers to kind of undertake research that is of relevance to government.
Thank you so much, Charles. Constantine.
Thank you, Carson. My name is Constantine Manda. I'm the co-founder and director of the Impact Evaluation Lab with the Economic Social Research Foundation, which is an economic policy think tank here in Tanzania that often works closely with government on economic policy making in Tanzania. The Impact Evaluation Lab was founded by myself and folks at ESRF in 2019 with funding from the Hewlett Foundation. One of the things that we do at the IE Lab basically work in 3 buckets. The first is capacity building, where we conduct training on impact evaluation methodologies for Tanzanian researchers, both in government and in non-governmental organizations. The second bucket is conducting research on impact evaluation, including across all sectors in development in Tanzania. And then finally, we also do policy engagement with government, including policy advice on several issues in Tanzania.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Constantine. Ronald, last but not least, and the baby of the group, the newest effort.
Thank you very much, Carson and the team. I'm happy to join the panel this evening. Yeah, I'm Ronald Mlebeke, and I'm a co-investigator on the EID project, as well as coordinating it. So the impact evaluation for evidence-based decisions is a collaboration amongst academics and researchers affiliated to the schools of public health, School of Statistics and Planning. This is within Makerere University, but also it involves some policymakers, and mainly in the sectors of health, education, and agriculture. It's now about 6 months old, and our main goal is to strengthen the use of impact evaluation in policy decisions and program implementation. And this is mainly through building and strengthening capacity for impact evaluation among the researchers, academicians, and policymakers in the 3 sectors mentioned. And also, we realized that we needed to coordinate and have a collaboration among impact evaluation researchers within the university, because a lot of work was happening and people did not know who is doing what. We also wanted to, the other thing we want to do is to integrate and strengthen teaching of impact evaluation among selected academic programs. And these are both from schools of public health and School of Statistics. The other thing we want to do is to jointly identify and implement flagship projects in impact evaluation in the sectors of health, education, and agriculture. And this is actually a project that is funded by the Hewlett Foundation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ronald. And as we heard from our keynote yesterday, Professor Ezra Saruma, it sounds like he's got some work for you guys. So in health and education and maybe other sectors. So thanks a lot, everyone. I know we have a big group today, so we're going to try to keep responses short. And I'm very excited to have all of you together to talk about some really interesting questions that have been coming up for us, and I'm sure for you as well. I want to start by letting everybody get a little bit of a better sense of what you do, and I think maybe reflecting on the last year is a good way to do that. So it's been a weird year, a challenging year, and I think a lot of our intentions have sort of been challenged, right? And I think at SIGA, we had to send our fellows home in last spring when COVID hit. We had to cancel our Ghana matchmaking workshop with Charles and our partners at DIWA. At the same time, it's been an incredible growth opportunity. So we've launched more virtual programs, which I think are here to stay, including the remote student exchange and the SIGA Global Workshop that Maya mentioned yesterday. And we've just launched a virtual fellowship program that I think is going to allow more and more diverse participants to come to our training programs. And of course, with the United States and much of the world focused on diversity and inclusion now, or refocused on it, we've thought a lot about how we can go beyond our fellowships to help make development economics as a discipline more inclusive. So I want to ask each of you to briefly tell us one thing that your program has accomplished in the past year that you're particularly proud of. So Jane, why don't you go ahead and start with PEP?
Thank you very much again. So as I said, our focus in PEP is really capacity building in research and policy engagement. And our key outputs are normally high quality journal publications and also intensive engagement in policy. And we are very happy to report that in 2020, in spite of the lockdown with COVID, our programs were not interrupted. We were able to do as much as we could with our publications, with at least 12 publications in 2020 alone. And 40% of these were from low income and fragile countries. And then also the fact that we continued actually to intensify our policy engagement. We initially feared that because most governments do not embrace technology, that would have a problem since we are doing co-production of knowledge, but we were able to continue with that. In the same year, we were able to intensify our distance training programs, online courses, including introducing one new one added this year. And we were able to have at least 62% of the participants, about 200 participants, 62% of them were from low-income countries. And finally, I think what we are most proud of is our impact evaluation research, because in spite of the onset of COVID-19, initially we delayed continuation of our field experiments, but within a short while, we were able to pick up, and we were able to proceed with them as planned, except for one case where we actually had to push it to 2021 because of the timing of or the nature of the timing of that particular experiment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jane. I'm glad to hear that you've been able to push most of your things forward despite the lockdown. Annette, go ahead and tell us about NERA. What are you proud of from the past year?
I think about NERA, of course, I mean, last year was a difficult year, and so was it also for NERA, but good enough we were able to move in promptly and deliver on some of the mandates, especially on evidence generation and policy outreach. So, for example, we had researchers led by Sam Oti explores the impact of COVID lockdown measures on researchers in the region, and this appeared on the 3IA blog. I think that was really interesting. But also Professor Amos, who leads NERA, was able to engage in a research to identify the impacts of the COVID-19 lockdowns on the informal sector in Kenya. Again, this was very important for the discussion, the policy discussion of the impacts of this virus on Kenya as an economy. But also other researchers such as Anthony and colleagues in Ethiopia were still able to come up with the curricular development. And Tony particularly also was able to, I think he presents that research today, look at the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on East African trade. So ideally, members of NERA were able to deliver on some of the research that they had proposed to do.
That's great. I mean, it's been so frustrating to watch governments not really know how to respond to COVID because they don't have the information that they need about how COVID and the lockdowns have been impacting people on the ground. And so it's great that NERA members and others have been able to very quickly collect the information and process the information that has been needed to respond. Charles, why don't you go ahead and tell us about GIMPA and CLEAR, or DIWA? Oh, you're on mute. We can't hear you. Now try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go for it.
Great, thank you so much. So, well, DIWA, in spite of COVID, I think we've made, I would say, significant progress. Our thematic areas have been, looking at three main issues. One is the training of researchers and policymakers in impact evaluation. We're able to do this successfully, though it has to be online because of the challenge of bringing participants together. We were able to train about 47 researchers from several universities in Ghana, and also we had participants from Benin and also Nigeria. We also were able to bring 9 government ministries, so roughly about 25 participants from various ministries. And we introduced them to some rigorous methods for conducting impact evaluation. Through that training, we're able to also continue with the matchmaking, where we now match policymakers with local researchers within our sub-region, together with SIGA affiliates who were to serve as mentors. Now, all these were conducted online. So through that, we were able to come up with, I think, 20 one project across 7 ministries. These ministries included health, education, energy, social protection, and so on. And through a very competitive process, after they've submitted proposals on these projects, we were able to select 9 of them and awarded grants ranging between 15,000 and 50,000 to conduct evaluations. Now, the interesting thing about DIWA is that we want to make sure that every research conducted is of relevance to policymakers. So if the policymaker is not interested in that project, it cannot be selected. So all the projects were actually proposed by the various ministries, which reflected their priorities. Currently, all these 9 projects are the initial stages. They are collecting data, and we hope that we can start reporting on some progress. The third aspect of DIWA is a visiting fellowship, which I think is really a flagship initiative in a sense that it offers our researchers opportunities to visit SIGA and engage with their mentors, present their work during various seminars, similar to what happens with the East Fellows. So we're in a process of selecting 4 West African researchers. They will be going to SIGA in the fall of 2021 and the spring of 2022. Yeah, so basically, this is what we have achieved. And another interesting development is that through this initiative, we are having some ministries now approaching us to expand our research work, and that they were willing also to fund some of the research work, because we couldn't find many interesting projects from the ministries. We just received some requests from the Ministry of Education saying that they want to expand the relationship to undertake other research that is of priority to the ministry.
That's great.
So far, this is what we've been able to do.
Well, I'll piggyback on that and say that I would count that as a proud moment for SIGA too, that we were able to pivot from having our workshop canceled. I mean, we were all very skeptical as to whether we could actually do successful matchmaking remotely. And it seems so far that we have. I'm really excited about the projects that you've selected, and excited to see how they pan out, because I think prioritizing work that is created directly in collaboration with policymakers can be a little bit higher risk, but it can also have a really, really high return. So I'm excited to see if we're able to have an impact there. Constantine, go ahead.
Thank you, Carson. The one thing that we are very, very proud of here at the Impact Evaluation Lab at ESRF here in Tanzania is the success we've had, not only in the past year, but since the lab has been created, on capacity building. So one of the big milestones is, of course, training almost 200 researchers in government, in academia, and elsewhere in Tanzania over the last couple of years. But also the success we've had with specific individual participants of our training exercises, including also kind of follow-on mentorship and engagement with the whole community, including online workshops, especially in the last year because of COVID-19. So most recently, we have had 2 of our former participants winning graduate university scholarships in the United States, one with the University of Minnesota to go do a PhD in economics, and secondly, with Harvard University to do the Master's in Public Administration, International Development at the Harvard Kennedy School. And this success, I think, highlights one of the major barriers with kind of, local African young people who are in some ways even more brilliant than, competitors in other parts of the world, is this kind of idea of signaling that they are of high quality just as much as the other kind of admitted candidates in these programs. And so one of the critical things that I think we've been able to successfully do is either through research mentorship to kind of elevate the quality of the research that they're conducting, But also, we have to admit that, a signal from Constantine Manda is not going to be as strong as a signal from Ted Miguel in terms of trying to get into these programs to create further research networks with these institutions that are important in terms of research output and include people who are really gatekeepers by either being editors in top journals or in many ways being members of these admission committees. So the biggest success we're really, really excited about in the last few weeks is seeing 2 of our former students, young researchers, get admissions to Harvard and the University of Minnesota.
That's awesome, Constantina. And I'm glad that you said that, because it's a complement to a lot of the other work that groups, including SIGA, are doing. We focus on typically on fellows who have already obtained a graduate degree or they're in the process of obtaining. You're talking about the pipeline, right? And how do we really create an environment where African students can thrive and get access to the opportunities that they need to be part of this, to succeed in the system that exists. And we're going to talk about the system in a little bit. Ronald, I'm glad you're back. Can you tell us briefly about something that you're proud of from the last 6 months at IEED? I know launching it is something to be proud
of. Thank you, Carson. Yeah, IEED is 6 months old at the moment, and we are just rolling out our activities. But I'm glad to report that we've been able to create to attract a number of scholars, a number of academics and researchers within the university who have picked a lot of interest in the project. And this has encouraged us a lot. And this has also actually moved on, it crossed over to the respective ministries we are working with at the moment, Minister of Health and Minister of Education, and also Minister of Agriculture, Animal Industry and Fisheries. And through this, we've been able to collaboratively accomplish a 3 weeks training in impact evaluation that was facilitated by SIGA and 3IE. And this attracted over 35 participants across these 2, actually, Office of the Prime Minister, Minister of Health, and Minister of Education and Agriculture. We've been also able to have a number of researchers from the university that attended this training. The other thing we've been able to achieve at the moment is to jointly select research projects with Minister of Education and Health, and this has been done collaboratively through the Office of the Prime Minister. So far we are rolling out slowly, and we are believing that the terrain will keep smooth as we move on. Thank you.
That's great, Ronald. Sounds like you're off to a really strong start. So I like this group because we have, a variety of different activities. There's obviously some overlap, but I also feel that these efforts are highly complementary. These groups are offering fellowships and training. They're supporting research led by African scholars. They're providing research mentorship, and they're also helping with this sort of pipeline issue of getting African scholars interested in research and then in the door in terms of access to education. So I want to jump into our first sort of debate question, which is, and we're going to do popcorn style, so we don't have to go in a specific order here. But we talked about this publication gap, and this is, the statistics that we keep citing to motivate our work are that, less than 8% of the top 5 publications related to Africa have an African co-author, okay? But every time I hear those statistics, I think, that's one way to measure inclusion. But I think that there are a lot of other ways to measure it too. And I really wanted to ask all of you, what do you feel is the state of inclusion in global development research? How do you measure success in this regard? And how, sort of a related question is, why is inclusion so important? Okay, so who wants to start?
So I can start, Carson. I think there are several issues with respect to inclusion. And I think, you know, in the whole ecosystem of all the work that we're all doing, the work at SIGA with EAST, the work with NIERA, with impact evaluation researchers in Africa, and the work that we're conducting in Tanzania, in capacity building, in research, and in policy engagement. The critical thing to think about is to understand why other disciplines of researchers coming from Europe, coming from North America, have succeeded much more than you know, economics has, in particular, with research publications and expanding the diversity of researchers who are conducting, you know, cutting edge research, is, I think, telling. And I think there are two ways to think about it. One is the kind of pull factor that I think needs to be emphasized among researchers based in American institutions, in European institutions. You know, take, for example, public health. Public health does a much better job of integrating local researchers throughout the research pipeline, so that after a decade or so of a particular public health sets of interventions in a particular public health organization, you start to see local researchers emerging as principal investigators, leading research projects, leading the whole research pipeline all the way to publications in the best journals. You start to see another generation of local researchers going into these elite institutions, becoming faculty members, contributing in the knowledge production in those institutions. And so I think there is that pull factor where researchers and academics based in the top universities in the US and Europe and elsewhere need to really try and think about why is it that they don't involve a lot of their local research assistants in the knowledge pipeline all the way, so that they can be co-authors, so that signaling can be made so that they can go on to further studies and then come back and contribute to that research pipeline. And the second, I think, is coming from the local institutions themselves. So the NIERAs of the continent, the Partnership for Economic Policy, RFs of the continent, to be able to push young researchers who can then continue that kind of pipeline in the next generation. And over several iterations of research projects, I don't think that it's impossible for economics, political science, and other social sciences conducting research in Africa to be able to create the successes that we're observing in public health, for instance.
So, yeah, I think that that's an interesting point. And of course, it's one thing for, you know, faculty at top institutions in the US to give credit. I think they can, the low hanging fruit is that they can start acknowledging the contribution, like bringing in contributions from LMIC scholars and acknowledging those contributions. But there also may be a shift in norms that we need to see in the economics discipline and the development economics discipline across the board. And that may take a little bit longer and require maybe more input from at an institutional level. So we can all think about that. Who else is ready to? Yeah, Jane, go ahead.
Okay, I can say something. I was not sure whether whether I got the question different, but maybe just to quickly talk about first, maybe the current state of inclusion. I know you've talked about the numbers. I'll just say that actually in 2020, we commissioned some of our research fellows to assess the issue of marginalization of Global South researchers in the field of economic development research and policy, not necessarily impact evaluation, but broadly in global development research. And one of the papers that they did, they analyzed 15 development journals on the Elsevier Scopus database. And what they observed is exactly what Carson, you said, that there's a much larger number of citations to northern authors. We know that is a fact, but we now have data that we've actually corrected, that this was followed by citation to core authors among northern and southern authors. And finally, of course, what comes last, as we know, is southern authors, irrespective of where they are residing. And then one of the other things they highlight is that even journals which have a lot of emphasis on the southern areas, such as, for instance, the Journal of African Economies, the China Economic Review, and so forth, have a predominance of citations from Northern researchers. So there's a lot of evidence for that. But then asking the question, in what way inclusion of these researchers, maybe from the Global South, in research can have better outcomes. What we have seen, or what we know from our initiatives, is that involving the researchers from the low-income countries will, of course, bring a deeper understanding of the social, political, and economic context of the countries than the outside experts. And I'm sure that even in SEGA, that's why you try to kind of match make, because the local researcher, even if they may not be at a very high level, have a better understanding of the local context, is better able to interact with the local policymakers, maybe more easily than someone who is coming from outside. And we know that knowledge of the local context, of course, is very important for the design of the research, the interpretation of the research, and of course, translating the findings into actual applicable recommendations. So we think that that is very important. Then we've also noted that the challenges and issues relating to the implementation of reform, of development policies, of course, keep on changing and keep emerging. And this is where really we need the national and regional governments working together and always looking for sound advice and maybe evidence that is from the grassroots or contextualized. And again, who is able to work with this evidence, we believe that the local researchers. And therefore, one of the things that we are doing is to try to encourage the local researchers to interact very closely with the policymakers from the onset of the work in co-production, so that in the end, they can ensure that the research can fit into policy debate. Maybe finally, I would say that maybe having very well-trained and participating local researchers is also essential if we are to ensure that we can systematically monitor and gather information that can be used further for policy making, or actually designing what we are again calling empirically based policy design. Because we know what used to happen in the past. Everyone would say that any material you produce is for the university shelves, is for academic journals, but there's no link to policy. I think that is the part that we would really want to bridge. And for examples, we have a lot of impact stories. I will maybe type give the link on the chat. We have a lot of impact stories on from PEP, whereby our well-trained researchers have been involved directly in the design of policy interventions in their countries. And right now we have 2 ongoing projects, which we are very proud of, that in spite of COVID-19, we have 2 impact evaluation projects, one in Benin and one in Guinea-Bissau, that have actually been led by local teams, and they have been able to point out to the direct effect of COVID-19 in market access. And these researchers actually are already being asked to help the government in dealing with issues of COVID-19 or COVID-19 policies. Thank you.
That's great, Jane. I think this is a common theme actually throughout the summit, is that the co-creation of research with policymakers is a very good way to ensure that the evidence is relevant and that it is useful and used by policymakers. And I think involving local scholars, you articulated that very well. Why is inclusion so important? Because these relationships, I think, are much easier for the trust that's sort of critical in forming these relationships is more easily built by researchers from the local context. And Charles, that's why we've set up DIWA the way that we have, right?
Yeah.
Charles or Annette, do you want to add? And I think
so
Rahul is still with us. He just has his video off. Go ahead, Charles.
Okay, so great. Yeah, I just want to say that I see a changing trend. I mean, if you look at the past 10 years, I think there's been a significant achievement in terms of research work emanating from Africa. And we need to be able to acknowledge this improvement. I think what we want to see is more of this happening. I foresee that in the next 5 to 10 years, I mean, if this DY East initiative and the others will continue building research capacity within our universities to undertake policy relevant research work, I think we'll be able to report more progress. One of the challenges, of course, we have faced is the limited research funding from our universities to conduct some of this research work. And so I think working together with our development partners who have interest in actually helping African universities to build their own capacity. And especially if I look at this Hewlett's support, which actually allows the universities to develop their own research agenda, think about capacity building that reflects the university's own priorities. For me, I think this is the kind of support that we need, because most of the time, universities are not setting their own research agenda. The agenda is actually set by the funding institutions. The other thing is we need to promote our own African journals. I mean, definitely if you are an African and you want to publish something that is done somewhere in Ghana, it might not necessarily be of interest to many of these journals who want to see what is happening in China and, Singapore, Malaysia, and others. So I think that it is time for us, as part of promoting our own development agenda, to think about how we can promote our own channels for disseminating our research. Let's improve on the quality of the journals in the region so that we can be able to sell our own outputs. So that's what I want to say.
Thank you for saying that, Charles. I think I was reading an article recently that talked about, if you look at the top economics journals, for example, very, very few, if any, of the editors are African, right? And so we have a system. This was the system that I was referring to earlier. It is very global north or high income country centric. And so does that system, do we need to break the system or expand the system by, let's say, creating more African journals, or I don't know, thinking about other definitions of successful research than you've published in an existing top economics journal? Constantine, do you have thoughts on that as somebody who has published in a top economics journal? Do you feel that that is, an acceptable way to define success and inclusion of African scholars, or should we rethink the way that we define that?
No, I think the long-term ultimate goal should be to have greater representations in editorial boards within the top journals. I mean, when we talk about inclusions within the top econ journals, we're not just talking about geographic inclusion, right? But also gender as well. I mean, we've seen with, folks like Esther Duflo taking on the helms of top journals and the type of research that how diversified it is, and the impacts of having people who are as diverse as possible also in these editorial boards. So I completely agree. I don't think we are going to have the success that we observe of Latin American researchers, that we observe of Asian researchers who have been able to succeed in many ways precisely because they sit in faculty positions in these top departments. They sit within the editorial boards of top journals. And so if Africans are going to be greatly or proportionately represented in those gatekeeping positions, there is a need for, eventually the ultimate goal should be to have many more African scholars sitting in these departments, sitting in these editorial boards, making decisions on funding, on publications that have impact across a diverse spectrum of the profession.
Yeah, that's great. Anna, do you want to add to this?
No, to add to that, I think, of course, it does matter on who sits on the editorials of these journals, but also maybe to just start with beyond, the process of publication, the submission, the reviews, and then it gets published. But also at the submission level, still we're seeing a very low percentage of Africans actually doing the submission to not only these top journals but also our own journals. So definitely maybe there is a problem there which we should acknowledge. So that brings me to maybe the second issue that we have to think about is, so where is the problem? Is it a capacity issue, or is it a funding issue? I know my colleagues Jane and Charles and Constantine have hinted a little bit on where the challenges could be coming from. And one thing that comes up, of course, the capacity issue. Still, I refer to this report that was produced by Hurwitz, I think, and also another researcher from South Africa, that also Maya referred to yesterday. That capacity, for example, in impact evaluation in Africa actually seems to be immense than what we know on ground. So so if that is not the problem, then I think perhaps the biggest problem comes around funding. And funding, of course, right now, most of the research we are depending on external funding from the north. But what about our local governments? To what extent have we engaged them to fund research? And in that regard, perhaps maybe the funding is not happening in our local economies, because maybe the policymakers do not see the relevance of our research. So I think a step in the right direction, and which I usually like to cite, is ensuring that the policymakers understand the relevance of the research that we are doing. And for me, an example that I usually cite out is the Office of the Prime Minister in Uganda, the Monitoring and Evaluation Department. I think it has reached a step where they are very receptive to impact evaluations, because first, of course, our interactions with them, the East Fellows, but also with the 3IE, and I see a step in the right direction, that any programs they're now considering, thinking about randomized controlled trials using government funding, but also, of course, the external funding never misses out. And then for the capacity issue, in as much as maybe to some level there's some steps that have been made, I think more steps. I mean, today we have had in this panel that almost every organization is doing some bit of training. And I would like to emphasize that this training should be, deliberate and systematic. I like to see the approach that IAED takes, where lecturers are going to be trained, and then we go to the curriculum development, and then we reach the students in close partnership with SEGA affiliates, but also with mainly in partnership. So I think that is a step in the right direction, and I see I'm very optimistic that we are getting there.
That's great, Annette. Thank you. Ronald, do you want to add?
Just to add on to what the colleagues have mentioned, where does that problem come from? Maybe one of the things we could be thinking about, where the priorities for research set from? Research priorities, where are they set from? Is it from the African countries where the research is done from? Is it set by the funder? Is it set by the development partners? And I think this kind of should helps a lot, especially when the local context and the local environment has to be developed in order to promote and use the research. And also in order to add value to research that comes out of the African continent. Most of the time we've had, and we in most of these scientific meetings where the journal editors are teaching us about how to write a scientific paper and how to make sure the editor is impressed with what you're writing. Most of the time you realize that if a paper does not have someone probably from the north, the global north, that paper may be challenged a lot. And when a paper has a name from the global north, it is easily taken up. And when a paper has a name from the African continent, it is easily taken up. And when a paper has a name from the African continent, it is easily taken up. And when a paper has a name from the African continent, it is easily taken up. And when a paper has a name from the African continent, it is easily taken up. And when a paper has a name from the African continent, it is easily taken up. And when a paper has a name from the African continent, it is easily taken up. And when a paper has a name from the African continent, it is easily taken up. And when a paper has a name from the African continent, it is easily taken up. And when a paper has a name from the African continent, it is easily taken up. And when a paper has a name from the African continent, it is easily taken up. And when a paper has a name from the African continent, it is easily taken up. And when a paper has a name from the African continent, it is easily taken up. And when a paper has a name from the African continent, it is easily taken up. And when a paper has a name from the African continent, But again, my thinking is that if research priorities are set from the field, if I may use that language, and especially the African continent, where most of the research is done, because that's where most of the problems are. That's where the disease burden is, about 25% of the global disease burden is in Africa. That's where most of the poverty is. And therefore, if everything starts there, then we should be able to have this research being spearheaded by the local African researchers, and hence this work will be published. But also we need to, someone has mentioned about African governments trying to promote research or getting funding for research. This is another very important aspect, probably because if the development partners actually, if they are putting aside funds for research, most likely they will set the agenda. But if the African governments can also put aside funds for research to fund their local research, this can also help to promote the African researchers. Annette has already mentioned about the approach that EAT project is using, which is actually aimed at promoting or developing local scholars in Uganda. This is quite helpful, and I hope this will help us to go a long way, thanks to the Hill Foundation. That enabled us actually to make sure that we generate what we really need according to the context. And we've gone ahead to collaborate with Office of the Prime Minister and with the respective ministries to be able to generate these research topics. Hopefully this will be able to give us the lead, even as we are collaborating with SEGA to actually support these flagships, these research topics which have been identified. And here we are saying, yes, we want to take the lead, but also we need support, we need a hand, we need a mentoring hand. And these collaborations or partnerships that promote development for the local researchers are quite important. And hopefully they'll be able to get the local researchers into the limelight out there.
That's great. Thank you, Ronald. Actually, just in the last couple of years since I led a similar panel in Kampala a few years ago, and we've seen a lot more funding going directly to African institutions for African-led capacity building and impact evaluation programs. And SIGA is very excited to be partnering with DIWA and to be partnering with GIMPA on DIWA and partnering with Makerere University and IEED. And we're excited to sort of figure out what is the best way to collaborate with you so that we're not stepping on your toes, but we're able to provide the kind of support that you actually need from us. So we're glad to be working with you all to figure out that model. So we're getting very close to time here. I don't see any pressing questions from the audience, but if someone has one, get it in there right now. I love that we've sort of transitioned naturally to my final question, which was what barriers to the inclusion of African scholars remain and how can we address them? So we talked about lack of funding for African scholars, and Ronald, you mentioned how some of this funding should come from African governments to really promote African researchers and demonstrate value, lack of capacity, and also lack of not just to conduct the research, but to develop their own agendas rather than needing to be, responsive to agendas that are set by other institutions, including funding institutions. We talked about lack of African journals or African representation on editorial boards and how that sort of makes the incentive structure not work well for African scholars. And Annette, you mentioned the publication process itself. So how do we get more submissions from African scholars? And those are all great. And I'm wondering in the last few minutes, if you all could mention very briefly, what gives you hope? What are you optimistic about for the future, thinking about these challenges?
Right. So Kaisa, maybe I can start. Right. Yesterday we were privileged. I mean, GIMPA, we were privileged to host the Minister of Education who, gave a talk presenting his policy agenda for the Ministry of Education because he was just appointed. And there's something amazing happening. I think that leadership at the political level is very key in driving some of these changes. Now, what this new minister has done, he has actually formed what we call the Education Sector Research Group, consisting of top researchers from various universities in Ghana. They meet regularly to set what we call the Education Sector Research Agenda. Now, the ministry on its own is funding research in very key areas, right from basic education to tertiary education. So the ministry is setting its own agenda and ready to commit its own funding to undertake research that is of priority. And I think that, and fortunately, GIMPA, we happen to be part of the research group. And I think this is something that can be replicated in various ministries and various countries so that the research coming out of these, the findings will be absorbed for policy decision-making.
That's really exciting, Charles. Thanks for sharing that example. So I've been told that we can take 5 extra minutes. Of course, that means that we're taking 5 minutes of your break. So if anybody needs to run off and grab coffee, please do so. But Jane, go ahead. Tell us why you're optimistic. Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. What we are very optimistic about. Basically what I would say is that we are saying that there's marginalization of Southern researchers. It's true in many respects. I know we didn't, Carson, we didn't really have time to tackle question 3, but I think we have all the pointers. But I think we are very happy with what we have done to date and what our sister institutions, including all the institutions represented here, are doing. So the way I look at it is that the capacity that we have built so far is already important. We have capacity to carry out successful impact evaluations, even by African researchers themselves, maybe with a bit of mentorship, with a bit of capacity building. And this is actually growing in the continent. It has been doing so over the last 1 decade. We have better capacity for data correction. I know there's a time that no one wanted to think about primary data because it was believed that the data that would come out would not be useful. But we have evidence that we can correct very good data for field experiments, for randomized control trials. I believe that that is not a mean achievement. Also, there's increasing awareness within governments about the need to implement evidence-based policies. We no longer have the very clear-cut silos between researchers and government. I think this idea of co-production coming together is another achievement that we cannot downplay. So all these actually provide what I would call a good springboard to consolidate these efforts to ensure that we can push research in the global south to a higher level, and where we can then help our local researchers to take off and reduce maybe the level of marginalization, whether it is in research, whether it is in policy making, or whether it is in publications. So I believe that going forward, if our researchers can actually keep focused and keep knocking, they'll be able to make a better contribution in development research. Finally, I would say that I'm also confident that there are increasing opportunities for Southern researchers to network with Northern institutions. We have them. SEGA is already doing that. And we know that this is only possible because we have a lot of support from our fathers. especially Hewlett Foundation. And for us, we have other funders such as IDLC, among others. I think this networking opportunity is what is going to help bridge the gap between research quality, publications, participation in international fora, and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. I just want to mention that Stephen Mailu made a good point, which is, GIMPA has already formed these linkages with the Ministry of M&E in Ghana. How can some of these other institutions do that so that there's a clean interface between what happens at the institutions and what the ministries are doing so that the response support can be responsive? Annette or Constantine or Ronald?
Yeah. Let me answer that. I think it's quite interesting. First, I'm very optimistic that the discussion actually is happening on inclusion, not only here, but on Twitter. I also brought it up at my WhatsApp.
If it's happening on Twitter, then it's real.
Yeah, I think it's real. I mean, because I just brought it up also in a WhatsApp group at my former institution. It's a research institution in Uganda. And we talked about everything that we're talking about now. And we concluded that for that institution, we need to come up with our own journal, like develop our own journal. And then we start from there. But and for me also, despite the pandemic, I think something positive that has come out at the virtual meetings, the conferences that now surely African researchers, we need to join these conferences that have gone virtual, and trainings as well, and classes. I think that's really a very important opportunity that we should not miss out, and that we should bring out to the other researchers. But to go back to the question, to your last question on the policy and how we reach out to the M&Es, I think for the case of Uganda, me myself as a NERA member, I've worked closely with the Office of the Prime Minister for almost 3 months, and I think has sitting on their committee. I think there's a working committee. So basically, those are some of the avenues by which we can bring research onto the policy table. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I think Kizito might agree with you here about the journals. He says, apart from targeting Global North top journals, why not develop or groom African journals that could generate context-specific content? Constantine, go ahead.
Yes. Yes. To kind of speak to what we're hopeful about here at the IE Lab at ESRF, I think across the 3 buckets of work that we do, I'm hopeful on the capacity building front, because despite being only around for about 2 years formally, we have had some success with creating the next kind of, supporting the next kind of generation. So initially, and this is due to a lot of collaboration with SIGA, with folks like NERA, we were able to, for example, have a former participant of ours win the East Visiting Fellowship, which is in some ways a wonderful thing, being someone who was given support myself as an East Visiting Fellow about 8 years ago to see the next kind of generation of people go and secure these. And this individual has gone on to become an important member of NERA, and we hope will continue some of the work that we're doing here in Tanzania and in the region. But also, as I said earlier in my opening statements, these achievements of getting 2 younger researchers to go and do graduate studies in the US at Harvard University and the University of Minnesota, I think gives me a lot of hope that, the capacity building that I received, the support that I received, that I've continued to receive from SIGA and through the East Fellowship, through NERA engagements will filter through to the next generation. With respect to research, I think that's a much harder pipeline to affect, and I think it's going to take a lot more work, but we are seeing some of the younger researchers as well publishing in international journals, not necessarily yet at the kind of Quarterly Journal of Economics or American Economic Review level, but we all have to kind of grow sequentially, and I'm hopeful that we will eventually start to see many, many more names and many more different faces, and not just the Amoses of the continent and the Tonys, Antonin Viang and others. And certainly unfortunately, one of the big things that we still are yet to do is to as Kizito said, and I agree, is to kind of build existing journals as well that we have in our academic institutions, to have them be strong signals of quality if we publish in those journals. And then finally, on policy engagement, I'm very, very hopeful. I'm hopeful as a Tanzanian because of a transition in government, but I'm also hopeful because even in the last few years, we have been approached. There's been a lot of demand from the president's office. There's been a lot of demand from ministries for policy analysis advice, for capacity building on impact evaluation. So there is a mindset change that is slowly materializing, where people are starting to think about counterfactual type of thinking in terms of policymaking. But more importantly, we're being deliberate with the next phase of the lab to include what I call kind of embedding within these ministries. So I completely agree with Stephen Mailu about working within these governments. I think oftentimes we come in as researchers and we demand some benefit from working with government because we want to publish in the top journals, because we want to further our own agenda. We rarely think about what services we want to give back and what value we want to give back to the ministries. And I think one of the experiences that we've had working with a local regulator on land transport, working with the Ministry of Agriculture, providing value and benefits to the ministry, including just simple data visualizations, data analysis of data that they already have, but don't have the capacity to analyze and summarize to be able to understand what what's happening in their purview. And so I think I'm very hopeful on all three fronts, and I think that there is a lot to be done, but I think we're headed in the right direction.
That's awesome. Thanks. Charles, did you want to add briefly?
Yeah.
We're over time, so make it quick.
Thank you so much. So I just want to say that we need to have a broader strategy if we want to work with government. One of the things we started with is supporting government to develop an evaluation policy, because then there is a policy direction to say that evaluation is needed and must be done for every project. And I think that is what has built the relationship and working with government to now undertake those evaluations. We've done the same thing also with ECOWAS. So ECOWAS is our regional, West Africa Economic Regional Group. We have supported them to develop an evaluation policy. So building on that, we are beginning to work with them to undertake some of the evaluations of regional integration programs. So what I want to say is that we need a whole strategy to work with government and also with the regional bodies when it comes to evaluation work. Thank you.
Thanks for adding that. Ronald, you got the last word.
Yes, I think as we continue to promote development of the local researchers and carrying out joint projects or research projects with policymakers and program implementers, I believe that this is going to create an environment and a context in which a lot of evidence is going to be used for policy decision making in our governments. And also it's going to encourage probably even the putting in place funds that should be able to promote research. For example, the Ugandan government so far has put out 3 grants for the COVID research since the COVID time, and this has actually promoted a lot of research projects within the universities, public universities within the country, and this has been very, very helpful. So as we continue partnering and working jointly with governments, we should be able to go a long way to promote evidence use in our countries. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Ronald. So I want to make sure that folks have a 5-minute break before we go to our next session. I'm so grateful that all of you have joined us. Jane, Annette, Charles, Constantine, Ronald. This was a really interesting conversation. I know that we could go on for many more hours. So I think I speak for all of my SIGA colleagues when I say that we're just so proud to work with all of you and your talented colleagues. And so I'm feeling optimistic. Hopefully you are, and our audience members are as well. So